At Nomonhan in 1939, Japanese officers fighting Soviet forces in sub-zero temperatures found their Nambu Type 14 pistols freezing solid. The firing pin spring lost tension in the cold, and misfires became common enough that some units reportedly kept a mallet on hand to strike the safety free. That flaw followed the weapon for the rest of the war. The Type 14 was the standard sidearm of the Imperial Japanese Army, carried by officers, vehicle crews, and artillery personnel who couldn't keep a rifle within reach. Chambered in 8mm Nambu with an 8-round magazine, it was light and compact, built for an era that expected a pistol to be carried far more than fired. Then, total war changed the math. As Japan's industrial base thinned, manufacturers simplified production to keep pace, and quality started depending entirely on when and where a given pistol was built. Later production Type 14 shipped with rougher finishing and looser tolerances than the ones made just a few years earlier. The Nambu showed that a pistol could fail not because of its original design, but because war demanded more than designers had anticipated. Italy's answer was the opposite philosophy: a simpler weapon, fewer complications, and a sidearm built around one requirement: dependability. The next weapon answered the same battlefield problem with a completely different idea. Italy abandoned the pursuit of greater power and built a sidearm around simplicity, reliability, and confidence. Italian officers in North Africa carried the M1934 into some of the war's harshest conditions: sand that jammed heavier automatics, heat that warped tolerances, and it kept firing. Italy didn't chase the most powerful handgun of the era. It built a compact one that was simple, sturdy, and cheap to manufacture. Chambered in 9mm Cordo .380 ACP with a 7-round magazine, the M1934 was never meant to compete with rifles or submachine guns. It was built around a simpler truth: most soldiers carrying a pistol spend far more time carrying it than firing it. Its blowback design had fewer parts to break, easier to manufacture, easier to maintain, easier to trust. A pistol that fired every time the trigger was pulled brought a kind of confidence no spec sheet could measure. But the same choices that made it dependable capped its effectiveness. The 9mm Cordo round was smaller and weaker than most full-sized military cartridges, enough at close range, short on penetration beyond it. Reliability could earn a soldier's confidence, but it could not solve every battlefield problem. A weapon that worked perfectly was still useless if an army could not produce enough of them. Britain faced that exact challenge. The following question was not how powerful or advanced a pistol could be, but how efficiently it could place a dependable sidearm into the hands of an entire force. 6 shots. That was the entire argument for a British officer's life in a prolonged firefight. Because once the Enfield No.2 emptied, reloading it took roughly twice as long as swapping a magazine. By 1939, most military planners already considered the revolver a relic, but Britain needed millions of sidearms fast, and the priority wasn't sophistication. It was a weapon that could be issued widely, trained quickly, and kept running under rough conditions. Adopted in 1932 and chambered in 38 S&W with a 6-round cylinder, the Enfield's revolving mechanism had fewer parts to disable and no reliance on clean feeding. If a round misfired, the shooter just pulled the trigger again. In North Africa's dust and the Pacific's humidity, that simplicity outlasted more complicated designs. But mechanical soundness was never the Enfield's real weakness. Its weakness was arithmetic. The revolver had survived for decades because it was simple and dependable. But simplicity came with a cost. Every empty chamber created a moment when the soldier was no longer fighting the enemy, but fighting the weapon itself. The upcoming generation of pistols attempted to remove that weakness. This pistol replaced the revolver's limitations with a design built around faster follow-up shots and greater combat capability. 4 pistols down, 3 to go, and the next one hit harder than anything on this list so far. If you want the full breakdown of exactly how much stopping power each of these carried, that's coming right now. Subscribe before the Eastern Front, because Level 4 changes the entire conversation. At Stalingrad and Kursk, Soviet officers carried a pistol built on a simple bet: hit harder than anything the enemy was carrying, and worry about comfort later. Adopted in 1933, the Tokarev TT-33 marked a shift in philosophy. Earlier pistols on this list chased portability and durability. This one added something neither had prioritized: raw performance. It fired the 7.62 and 25mm Tokarev 8-round magazine, high-velocity round derived from the Mauser pistol cartridge, giving it a flatter trajectory and sharper penetration, valuable in a war fought around buildings, vehicles, and cover that swallowed weaker ammunition. The TT-33 wasn't built for refinement, it was built for function. A short recoil system designed for mass production at a moment when the Soviet Union needed every weapon it could turn out. The trade-offs were real: limited safety features, a narrow grip, a punishing cartridge. The USSR wasn't designing for peacetime. It was designed for a war consuming equipment as fast as it consumed men. The Tokarev solved one of the handgun's oldest problems, delivering more power from a compact weapon. But every improvement created another question. What was the value of a stronger pistol if the soldier carrying it still ran out of ammunition too quickly? Belgium approached the problem from a different direction. They challenged the idea that a pistol had to choose between combat effectiveness and ammunition capacity. Every pistol so far had solved a problem the moment it was fired. None of them had solved what happened after: a magazine running dry too fast in a fight that didn't end on schedule. For decades, most military sidearms held fewer than 10 rounds, a capacity that could vanish in seconds at close range. John Browning began the fix before his death in 1926. Belgian engineer Dieudonné Save finished it. The result was the Browning high-power, sturdy, manageable pistol built around a 13-round magazine, nearly double the capacity of most contemporaries. Then, the war split the weapon in two. Belgium fell to Germany in 1940 before full production began, and manufacturing divided. Canadian-built high powers went to Allied and Chinese forces, while the occupied FN factory kept producing the pistol for the German army that had just conquered it. The same design ended up armed on both sides of the war it was built for. The high power solved the problem of carrying more ammunition without sacrificing battlefield usefulness. But another question remained: could a pistol be redesigned from the ground up to become simpler, faster, and more efficient to produce? Germany's answer was a weapon that challenged nearly every assumption about the traditional military sidearm. Germany's standard sidearm in 1939 was the Luger P08, precise, respected, and increasingly difficult to mass produce for an industrial war on this scale. The problem was never whether the Luger worked, it was whether it could keep serving an army growing by the millions. In 1938, German engineers replaced it with the Walther P38. Chambered in 9mm parabellum with an 8-round magazine, it introduced a double-action trigger that let the pistol be carried loaded while staying safer to handle. A genuine departure from every earlier service pistol. Its locked breech system tamed recoil with full-power ammunition, and it was built from the start for large-scale wartime production. Where earlier pistols were designed around craftsmanship or simplicity, the P38 was designed around the demands of modern warfare. But even a complete design couldn't outrun a collapsing war economy. As German factories lost skilled workers to the front and materials to Allied bombing campaigns from 1943 onward, later P38s left the line with rougher tolerances and looser fits, not because the design failed, but because the country building it was coming apart around it. The P38 represented the future of handgun design. But the final weapon on this list would not win because it was the newest, the most advanced, or the most ambitious. It would win because it had survived the hardest test of all: time. The final pistol on this list was not created for World War II. a design that entered another war before this one and carried lessons forward that many newer weapons were still trying to solve. By the time the United States entered the war, the military pistol had already gone through decades of evolution. Smaller cartridges, higher capacities, simpler mechanisms, each generation fixing a weakness in the one before it. The M1911 wasn't the newest pistol in that progression. It was the one that had already proven itself twice. Designed by John Browning and adopted in 1911, it was chambered in .45 ACP, ran on a short recoil system, and carried 7 rounds, a cartridge chosen because earlier combat experience had raised real doubts about whether smaller handgun rounds hit hard enough at close range. It had already survived the trenches of World War I before a single American soldier carried it onto a beach in World War II. It served everywhere. Officers carried it alongside rifles. Pilots carried it as emergency equipment if they went down behind enemy lines. Tank crews carried it when there wasn't room for anything bigger. In every case, it did the same job. A dependable option when a soldier was forced down to something smaller than a rifle. It wasn't perfect. 7 rounds was fewer than the high power's 13. Its single-action system handled differently than the P38's modern trigger. But it offered something none of the others could claim at the same scale. Millions of American servicemen had trained on it, carried it, and knew exactly how it worked. In war, familiarity is its own form of reliability, because a weapon is only as good as the person who's used it 1,000 times before it mattered. The M1911 represented the final lesson of the wartime pistol. Every weapon before it had solved a different problem: reliability, production, capacity, or design. But the final measure of a sidearm was not what it promised on paper. It was what it delivered after years of use, under conditions no engineer could fully predict. The question was simple: would it work when it mattered most? 7 pistols. 7 different bets on what a soldier needed most when everything else had already gone wrong: power, capacity, simplicity, familiarity. None of them got every part of that bet right. Which raises the question worth sitting with. When the rifle's empty and the fight is still going, which one would you actually want in your hand? Let us know in the comments. The next video takes that same question into deadly sniper rifles. Subscribe so you don't miss it.